When I was in grade school, I was taught that liberals were my enemy, that God would send these non-believers to hell, and that it was up to me to ensure that the Democratic Party failed in everything it attempted. Because I wasn't just raised in an evangelical Christian church. I was indoctrinated into Christian conservatism. And I was one of the fortunate ones who were able to eventually walk away from it. But this isn't just about my story. We're going to talk about how these religious values uphold authoritarianism in plain sight. This is the Kayse Melone Show. Welcome back to the Kayse Melone Show. My name is Kayse Melone, and I'm so glad you're here. As many of you know, as I've been building this community, I have talked a lot about being raised in the evangelical Christian church here in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where I live. For the first 2/3 of my life, I was deep in the belly of evangelical Christianity, and I believed everything they taught me, from speaking in tongues to Christian Zionism. And it has taken a lot of work for me to deconstruct from all of those belief systems, from all of those ideologies that are very harmful, both internally to myself as an individual, convincing myself that I needed to subjugate myself for men, but also on the whole and for the other people I live on this planet with, people who might look differently than me or believe differently than me. The belief system I was raised in was so harmful for so many different ways, or for so many different reasons, and I am very vocal about that. I think it is very insidious to raise children in these environments. I'm very outspoken against them. But the reason that I'm talking about this conversation, the reason I'm having these conversations is not just to call out the corruption of the religious right and the Christian conservative cultures that are propagating here in the United States. It's also to speak to the people who are still in those environments, who were raised in those environments like I was, who maybe are questioning, who maybe are ready to walk away from these harmful belief systems, but are kind of concerned too. And for this episode of the Kayse Melone Show today, I want to dive into why it's so important to really take that step and walk away from these environments that are causing so much harm. Because there's something that's really been sitting with me lately, and it's this idea that the culture war in the United States is not the main event. It's not the main thing that is actually at root of all of the issues that is going on. It's the distraction. And that might sound like a bold claim, especially when we're living through headline after headline about, book censorship and anti-trans legislation and attacks on critical race theory. But if you zoom out, what becomes obvious to me is that these so-called moral panics are in fact very serious, but that they are manufactured and engineered distractions. Well, more than that, they are inherent divisions trying to pit people against each other, and they're doing exactly what they're supposed to do. They're dividing us. They're getting us to fight over symbols and identities and buzzwords, while the people actually hoarding the power and the wealth continue to do so unchecked. Because while we're arguing over whether certain people should use certain bathrooms or whether a teacher should be allowed to assign Toni Morrison, billionaires are buying politicians and corporations are writing legislation. And don't get me wrong, those are important issues to tackle, obviously. But in that same vein, my point here is what I'm trying to bring to the discussion is the fact that we're already being distracted from the most fundamental reality of our society, that we're in the middle of a class war. But because the people in power know that class solidarity would be their downfall, they pit us against each other in every other way possible. And they do this through the Christian conservative indoctrination that I was raised in. They do this by making sure that white evangelical Christians consider everyone else their enemy. That is who has been doing the bidding of those in power all along, evangelical churches. Now, before you get defensive, I'll say what I always say. I'm not here to dehumanize and villainize the everyday believers. I'm here to expose the institution, the belief system itself, the ideology. Because those churches, the ones I grew up in, they were ground zero for this kind of distraction. Again, I was taught that liberals hated America. I was told that gay people were trying to destroy the family. I was told that climate change was a hoax and that public school teachers were brainwashing kids to become communists. I was told to be a self-proclaimed Zionist and to support the statehood of Israel, no matter the genocidal cost. I remember hearing from the pulpit multiple times that voting in a liberal way was the same thing as voting for the devil, excuse me. And what I think is important to understand is that just because, according to the law, religious leaders from a pulpit, pastors from a church pulpit, can't openly endorse specific political figures running for office or specific political parties, doesn't mean they can't talk about the actual policies, the actual conversations, okay? And the thing is, I didn't hear this in some backwards shack. This isn't a fringe belief. I heard it in the wealthy, polished mega church with Broadway level productions of praise and worship services and like $1 million sound system or something like that. Like, there was money involved, okay? The emotional manipulation was covered in, bass drums and fog machines and praise music, and it was glossy. It was well funded. It was essentially a propaganda engine that presented itself as wholesome family values. And for the kids growing up inside it, like myself, it was all we knew. But even as a kid, I thought I had a choice. They told me I could choose Jesus. They said I had free will, that it wasn't about good works. It wasn't about how you acted. It was about your faith. And when you're a child and all of your friends, your teachers, your parents, and every adult you trust tells you that questioning God or not having faith in God will send you to hell, that's not really a choice. That is coercion. That is manipulation. They didn't teach me how to think. They taught me what to think. And they wrapped it up in the language of freedom. And that is the genius of authoritarian systems at heart. They don't always use force. Sometimes they use comfort. Sometimes they use belonging. You get community and safety and certainty so long as you never challenge the rules or challenge the belief system. Because if you do, you're not just wrong. You're not just participating in a free marketplace of ideas. You're considered dangerous. You're, more importantly, considered sinful. You'd be a threat to the fabric of the religious community. And that's how they maintain control. Not with, like very blunt violence, not with chains, but with shame. And here's the thing. It worked for me. It works because you can't manipulate people unless you give them something to feel or to root for. You can't manufacture allegiance without that emotional tie. But in order to make the distraction of the culture war work, in order to consider gay people and other ethnicities and other religions, before you can consider them your enemy, you need a powerful emotional hook, which is where childhood indoctrination comes into play. I'm going to walk you through, for those of you who weren't raised in this environment, what it was like being raised as a Christian conservative at a megachurch in a predominantly evangelical Christian city. Because you don't wake up one day like just believing in Armageddon and rejecting evolution and science, okay? You're primed. You are trained to think this way. You are immersed. I'm an atheist now, and I've been watching a lot of atheist content, and one thing that a lot of atheists will say is like, everyone is born an atheist. We are taught religion, right? And this is very indicative of that, all right? Because from purity pledges at youth group to being taught rapture theology in Sunday school, the fear of the world, of reality, is constant. And that is how the immersion works. There's always this sense that the end of the world could happen at any moment. I truly believed that. And that if you weren't right with God, such as, obeying your elders or rejecting anything liberal, you were going to be left behind. And I'm not kidding when I say that I and many other people had recurring nightmares about the rapture. I remember checking like the closets with, or, checking like my house if nobody else was home, or maybe I took a nap and I woke up and they were out running errands, but I didn't know that, and calling my parents just to make sure I hadn't missed the capital C call. It was crazy. And then there was, of course, youth group, which was the bait, right? Like free pizza, video games, Christian rock concerts, even breakdancing shows, like all for Jesus. I'm talking, again, full production value with the lights and the bass drums and the dropping the beat. It was honestly like kind of exhilarating. It was emotional. There was a tie to it. And then in the middle of all of that really high intensity performance, they would hit you with sermons about how sex before marriage or sex outside of a heteronormative marriage would ruin your life, and how certain ways to view politics were the only godly choice. Every moment of my upbringing was engineered to be emotionally memorable and therefore manipulative so that the messaging would stick deeper. Christian schooling, like for myself, because I didn't just go to the school, or I didn't just go to the church on Sundays, I also went to the Bible-based Evangelical Christian high school affiliated with that megachurch. And Christian schooling at this form of education added another layer of insulation. We were taught that climate change or environmentalism was basically pagan worship at best, or a complete fabricated host at worst. We were told that Zionism was non-negotiable, that the theory of evolution was literally satanic. We weren't allowed to question scientifically. We weren't allowed to question our pastors or our textbooks. Every lesson came with a prepackaged worldview, and that worldview was always centered around things like American exceptionalism because it was a Christian nation, Christian supremacy, and also, of course, patriarchal control. You weren't just learning math or science, you were learning submission, is really my point here. You were learning to distrust the outside world, to distrust secularism or the liberal Hollywood elites. You were learning that the truth could only come from those who had power in your community. The reality is, there are so many factors that caused my indoctrination as a Christian conservative to be powerful. And again, for people who weren't raised in the evangelical Christian church like I was, it can be hard to understand why today's MAGA supporters are so cult-like. But I have real sympathy for people who are still clinging to the worldview of Christian conservatism, to that environment, because they're hoping that their suffering in this world has some supernatural meaning. That's what they're clinging to. And don't get me wrong, I do think that there's definitely an argument to be made for holding Trump voters accountable for the mess this country is in, okay? For the authoritarianism they voted for. But I think it's a mistake to look at these misguided votes in every case, every single case, as a sign of someone's internal evil. Of course, there are actual bigots who hate people who aren't exactly like them. I'm not talking about them. But again, I was indoctrinated in this environment. I can promise you there are plenty of Christian conservatives who, while still deserving of our criticism, who are still deserving of our frustration at their stupidity for voting for Trump, are more misguided and afraid than specifically out to pick on the little guy. The reality is, it took a lot of work for me to question the belief system I was indoctrinated into. And I'm still trying to navigate how to challenge that belief system, how to get everyday Christian conservatives to question the messages coming out of the pulpit and how to empower them to change their own minds in this regard. I can guarantee you this, though. I can promise you that the more we feed into the narrative that this is all about Christian conservatives versus everyone else, the more we are playing into the narrative that proves their worldview correct. You're proving them right. The more we are playing into the culture war that the ruling elites want us to fall for. That is what's going on. The thing is, as much as I truly believe that everyone deserves to worship whatever gods they want, I still maintain that I think organized religion as a whole holds societies back from progressive progress and holds individuals back from authentic expression. And that brings me to the bigger picture here. Organized religion functions as a hierarchical control system. It sells itself as a spiritual guide, but what it's really doing is teaching you how to obey. You're taught that morality comes from authority in these environments, that truth is inherited, not internally discovered, that doubt is dangerous, and that the best thing you can do with your life is to submit to God's will. That is exactly what I was taught over and over again, which conveniently always seemed to line up with the pastor's opinions or certain politicians' policies. And if your questioning doesn't match that doctrine or that policy, it's labeled as rebellion. And when you grow up in such a tight-knit community, you don't really know what life will look like on the other side of that. If your lived experience contradicts the interpretation of scripture of that environment, it's framed in such a way to suggest that your experience is wrong. And I just think that's so dangerous. I was told that I had a personal relationship with Jesus, and this is an argument that a lot of Christians will fall back on, that it's not about, the good works that we do, or it's not about the way we vote. It's about having a personal relationship with Jesus. But I still maintain that such a relationship came with a long list of rules and an even longer list of enemies, because it wasn't a relationship. It was institutional loyalty. It was branding. Jesus was the figurehead, but the real power was in the church structure and in the community. And in that, the top of that structure was wealthy, mostly white men who made decisions for the rest of us and called it divine. And they were celebrities in their own right with, designer suits and book deals and all of the things. Like, their word was gospel, and questioning them was seen as heresy, not questioning your lived experience, questioning the pulpit. And let's talk numbers for a second, because sometimes data tells a story. According to the Pew Research Center, around 72% of white evangelical Christians still support Donald Trump. And in stark contrast, only about 10% of Black Protestants in this country do. And that's not just a difference in political preference, I would say. I think it's a window into two entirely different lived realities of Christianity in America. White evangelicalism has long been entangled with imperialism, with the project of American nationalism. It's a version of Christianity that has often prioritized order over social justice, or hierarchy over liberation, or power over empathy. We are seeing Christian leaders literally call empathy a sin. And guess what? The ones I've seen are white. From the moral majority to Christian Zionism to the modern day crusade against the so-called woke mind virus, like, white evangelical spaces have been shaped by a theology that happens to protect whiteness, wealth, and patriarchy. And it makes sense then that a candidate who centers his message on grievance, on hierarchy, on nostalgia, on authoritarianism would find his base there. Meanwhile, Black Protestant traditions, especially those rooted in the Black church, carry very often a different theological legacy. And obviously I wasn't raised in that environment, but my understanding is that these are communities that have historically used faith not so much as a tool of control, but as a means of survival and resistance. Black Christian churches have often emphasized liberation theology or social justice. So when people ask how can both of these groups call themselves Christian, the answer is, in a lot of ways, they're not practicing the same version of Christianity. And that disparity tells us something. It tells us that Christianity in America is not one faith, it's multiple theologies in conflict. And this is one of the critiques I have of organized religion as a whole. And if we want to understand how religion is being used to uphold authoritarianism, we need to be honest, first of all, about which version of it is doing the heavy lifting and why that might be. Okay, it's true that I do critique Christianity as a whole, but my issue with it, again, is not the everyday belief of individual Christians. It's how the beliefs of everyday Christians, particularly white Christians, are being manipulated to uphold the power dynamics that pit people against each other. Okay, and this kind of brings me into the prosperity gospel because, again, as I was growing up in the evangelical Christian church, we were literally told that if we tithed faithfully, God would bless us financially. And that if someone wasn't doing well in life, it's because they weren't enough of a believer. We were told that giving money to the church was a way to invest in our own personal success. Meanwhile, the pastors were living, yes, in like $1 million homes or whatever, and driving luxury cars, while again telling poor people to trust God with their finances. It was a pyramid scheme, and it worked because it was framed in a sense of the holy, of the sacred, of the spiritual, okay? Because it used the language of righteousness to reinforce the logic of capitalism, placing blame on poor people for their poverty. Okay? And if you didn't get rich, well, clearly your faith just wasn't strong enough. It almost like spiritualized wealth inequality and blamed the victims of poverty for their own oppression. And this is where moral panics come in again, because when people start to question that system, when the cracks begin to show and people realize that they're not getting the material conditions they want, and it doesn't matter how hard they work, they're still not as successful as the people on top, that is when the leaders pivot and they find a new enemy and they create a new panic. For example, in the 90s, it was the gay community. Post 9/11, it was Muslims. Today, it's trans people, but it's always the same script, okay? It's manufacture a threat based on fear of something that is a part of a different community outside of the centralized demographic of people you want to convince to vote for you. So in this case, white evangelical Christians. Then you stoke the fear and you justify the control, and you frame it all as protecting the children. Whenever I hear a white evangelical start talking about protecting the children, I very rarely believe them. The kicker of all of this is that the people most hurt by these panics, by the moral panic that is constantly manufactured, are often the very children they claim to protect. Because any kid who grew up queer in the Christian church knows what I'm talking about, or neurodivergent, or just generally questioning, okay? These kids are constantly being forced into shame or into silence or sometimes conversion therapy, and in many cases, homelessness. The reality is, let's be so for real. They're not protecting children. They're abusing them. They're indoctrinating them. They are grooming them to be obedient to a system that will exploit them economically, emotionally, and spiritually. And that indoctrination doesn't stop once you hit adulthood. It just evolves. It just becomes economic and political. Once you are of voting age, like it's a little bit more difficult to stop subscribing to this bullshit, to break free from it, because now you're a parent. Now you're passing it down to your own kids, right? You've become the compliant worker. And it's even harder to question the system. You become the voter who backs authoritarian policies out of fear, okay? And this is why I insist on critiquing religion, even when people tell me to let it go. It's not the thing is, for me, it's not just about whether or not people believe in God, and I think that that might be totally irrational. What I'm actually trying to critique is the machinery that belief becomes like a cog of. It's about the systems of power that use religious beliefs to justify harm. And that's where I draw a very firm line. We must critique the institution, the ideology, without dehumanizing the believer. Because again, so many of the Christians I know, including the ones I grew up with, are not malicious. They are kind, generous, thoughtful people who have been steeped in a toxic system. And many of them are already doubting. And yes, they need to be held accountable for, if they voted for Trump. I'm not doubting that. But I want to be there for these people who are already questioning, and maybe they just don't feel safe to say it out loud, or they don't want to lose their families or their communities or their entire social safety net, because I can attest to the fact that it's hard to leave the evangelical Christian church, all right? 13 years later, and I'm still dealing with the ramifications of that, all right? And another factor in this conversation that I want to make crystal clear is that I'm not trying to ban religious practice. I'm not trying to ban belief. Again, this is about dismantling the machinery of control that hides behind that belief, that uses belief for power. It's about recognizing what authoritarianism needs to rise to power. Because sometimes it really just needs a pulpit. It needs a Bible verse to convince people. It needs a really powerful praise and worship service, okay? And before you know it, you're singing along to the system of control you claim to protest. But okay, again, I want to be clear, I'm not talking about personal spiritual transformation, okay? I may be an atheist, but I do consider myself spiritual. I love the spiritual, not religious community. I totally vibe with that. What I'm talking about is institutional religion, structures built to consolidate power and force orthodoxy of any version or flavor, and that determines who gets to speak and who must stay silent. Because religion, when it's institutionalized, becomes the perfect format for authoritarian control. Why? Because it teaches people from the youngest age that there is one ultimate reality, one ultimate morality, and one ultimate authority. And that questioning that authority is dangerous, okay? Does any of this sound familiar, okay? Organized religion offers a ready-made system for totalitarian regimes, for systems of power. That includes patriarchal family structures, rigid gender roles, the demonization of outsiders, aka non-believers, and the idealization of suffering and sacrifice. It trains people to accept hierarchy as divine order. It replaces curiosity with doctrine, and I just think that it's a dream come true for any authoritarian leader, because they don't want you to think. They want you to comply. They want you to fall into line. And if you think that an eternity in hell is on the line, you'll do more than comply. You'll volunteer to defend it. Do you know what I mean? And that's the sinister aspect of religious authoritarianism. It doesn't need to rely on violence. It just needs to have an emotional bug in your ear. It just needs to convince you just a little bit. And then you'll vote for the violence to be committed. It's so cyclical like this. And that's what I wish more people understood. All right? Because when the state or when any policies are framed as blessings or, righteous from the pulpit, protesting against those issues becomes blasphemy. And it's why the line between church and state isn't just a constitutional issue, it's a survival issue. Because once those lines blur, the reason I'm fighting all of this, once the state starts to look like God, there's no space left for questioning it. There's only punishment. That's what it was like growing up indoctrinated in Christian conservatism. Even now, we're seeing politicians use religious language to justify stripping away rights from marginalized communities. banning or trying to ban people who identify as trans, banning books, abortion bans. They're being pushed with the vocabulary, with the rhetoric of moral righteousness, but their true purpose is control. And when you grow up in a system like I was that teaches you to equate righteousness with authority, you'll go along with it no matter what. You'll cheer it on, you'll vote for it, you'll call it freedom while you're slowly just, gilding your own cage. And that's why I talk about this. That's why I won't just leave my upbringing in the past, because authoritarianism isn't some far off threat. Fascism isn't in the future. It's here. And it's wearing its Sunday best. And unless we recognize how deeply it feeds on religious structure, on the cultural ideologies that people adhere to, we won't be able to fight it. Not effectively and not fully, and definitely not in time, since it's already here. Again, deconstruction to me, it's not just about changing your beliefs. I'm not trying to change anyone's beliefs. I'm trying to dismantle the hierarchy. This is about challenging the systems, again, that tell you who you're allowed to be and how you're allowed to live. It's not about infringing on religious freedom. It's about reclaiming agency and voice and curiosity and the multiplicity of the human experience, instead of pretending like our vastness as humans with conscious perceptions of this reality can fit into any box that a religious leader would like you to think it belongs in. Okay? That the guilt, the shame, the fear, all of those are tools of control every single fucking time. Every single fucking time. And this is not just for ex-Christians. There are all kinds of people who have been told to stay small, to stay silent, to submit. All right? Deconstruction is talking about any hierarchy, such as white supremacy, patriarchy, capitalism, organized religion, okay? Deconstruction is for the queer kid who was told they were an abomination. It's for the poor kid who was told their poverty was a lack of faith. Deconstruction is for the woman who was told her body was a temptation. Ugh. And it's for the kid who was shamed for being curious. It's for all of us who were told to sit down, shut up, and obey. When I say I'm an atheist, some people consider that to be a very nihilistic perspective. Some people hear bitterness. Some people immediately equate that with being an angry atheist. And I get it. I'm not a generally chill person. But also, for me, atheism isn't about the absence of meaning or wonder. It's a way to reclaim it in a way that's not anti-spirituality. Okay? I'm just interested in spirituality that doesn't demand my obedience or demand putting me in a specific box. I'm not against faith. I want to make that very clear. I'm against faith that's weaponized to control people. I'm against faith being used to control people. If anything, I would say that leaving organized religion gives so many people more reverence for life, for more, mindfulness in the moment, for the mystery of the universe and all of its complexity. I don't need to believe in an afterlife to love this planet. I don't need a God to practice compassion or kindness. Okay? And if your spirituality requires a threat of an afterlife spent in hell to make you a moral person, then maybe it's not morality at all. It's just fear. And I don't want to live my life in fear anymore. I don't want other people to live their life in fear anymore. I want us to enjoy the beauty and the wonder and the awe of this reality. I want curiosity. I want meaning that I don't have to inherit, okay? A lot of people think the goal of conversations like this is to convert others or, deconvert others. But again, I'm not here to make you think exactly like me. I'm not here to build a new doctrine or replace one belief system with another. I get accused of that all of the time. But I'm telling you, I'm here to liberate people from dogmatic rigidity, from the idea that our worth is tied to how well we conform. Because what we're up against isn't just about, again, faith, all right? I always say that Christian nationalism and religious authoritarianism is not about faith. It is about power, okay? This is the larger pattern of hierarchy where the few dominate the many and they call it order, all right? Deconstruction isn't about being right or perfectly rational. It's about being free. That's what I want people to remember. So if you're listening to this and maybe you still believe in God, but you're tired of the Christian conservative environment, or you're agnostic and you're still trying to figure it out, or even if you are an atheist and angry and still healing from religious trauma, this space that I'm trying to create isn't about everyone being the same. It's about solidarity and about building something better together. So if you're listening to this, if you're watching this, and you're wondering whether it is safe to start questioning, I want you to know that, you know what? I'm here. This community is here. We have some really awesome people joining in these conversations, and you don't have to stay in the environment you're in just because you were born there, all right? There is life on the other side. There is power in questioning and being skeptical, and you are allowed to begin again, and you are allowed to, become a more authentic version of yourself. The people who raised me, whether or not they realized it, they were trying to control what I thought. And I'm here to relate to you if that sounds like how you were raised. And when you do unlearn all of these things, I promise that life on the other side is worth it. So I hope you got some value out of this episode of the Kayse Melone Show. Please don't forget to join the Kayse and Friends Discord server to have further conversations like this one. And also tune into the daily broadcast live stream every day at 7 a.m. Central Standard Time on both YouTube and Twitch. I look forward to seeing you there.